Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our sixth Disability History lecture. The Disability History lecture series actually was founded by myself. My name is Pieter Verstraeten, Professor Patrick de Vlieger, who is at the very back of the room, and Professor Kaat Wels, who couldn't be here for the moment. She had an important meeting of the Research Council this afternoon and also this evening. So she apologizes for that. The lecture series was founded in 2012, and since that time we have touched upon divergent topics such as the guide dog, the Great War, deaf culture, and disability ethics. Most of these presentations can still be watched and listened to online on our website, and this is www.disabilityhistorylectureseries.wordpress.com. So if you are interested, please go to that website and click on all the links that you see. Today we are delighted to be able to extend our focus beyond the 18th, the 20th and the 19th century by listening to Professor Christian Laes talk about history of disability in Roman antiquity. It is therefore my pleasure to briefly introduce Professor Laes. He is affiliated to, if my information is still correct, 3 universities, the University of Antwerp, the Free University of Brussels, and the University of Tampere in Finland. He is educated as a classical philologist and is now considered as an expert in the social and the cultural history of Roman and late antiquity. Besides a recently published study by Cambridge University Press on the history of childhood in Roman antiquity, he has done a lot of research with regards to the history of disability in that same period. On the basis of his inquiries, he recently published 2 studies, one in Dutch, that you can see over here, Beperkt, gehandicapten in het Romeinse Rijk. And that book is published by Davidsfonds, and the other one is entitled Disability in Roman Antiquity, and that book is published by Brill. So if you are interested in the topic, you can buy a book over here, or you can order one on the website of Brill, I suppose, in an international bookshop. Today, Professor Laes represents some of the ideas and findings that formed the basis for these 2 volumes. And before giving the floor to Professor Laes, I explicitly want to thank Professor Katlijne van Torpen, who couldn't be here too, due to some familial circumstances I just heard, for the fact that she invited all her master's students to come over here and listen to Professor Christian Laes' talk. I also would like to introduce very briefly and thank Corneel van Lommel, who is sitting over here on the first row, because Corneel van Lommel is going to present a reply to Christian Laes' talk. So the structure of the presentations today will be as follows. Christian Laes will talk for 55 minutes up till 1 hour, and then I will give the floor to Corneel van Lommel, who will give his reply in, let's say, 10 minutes or so, and then the discussion is open for all of us. Before giving you the floor, I just will check what this noise is and try to get it a little more quiet here, and then we can start. Okay. Perfect. Silence. So thank you. Now the floor is yours for the next 55 minutes up till 1 hour.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good evening, everybody. It's very nice. It's really a pleasure to be here, to take the floor, and to be able to communicate not only with ancient historians, but also with historians of disabilities for other periods. I find that very important to do so, and so I'm glad that ancient history and classics get somehow integrated also into the larger discourse on disability history. So, what I'm actually going to do today is to shortly present my book, which just came out, that is some months ago, with David's Fonds, and of which an English version for Cambridge University Press is currently being prepared too. And so I would like to build my lecture focused on three principles. First of all, I will take the opportunity of offering you some nice, I hope, and surely interesting case stories. This is pretty much a book about human beings. And so I will start each chapter with a person which you can consider like emblematic for the disability which is treated. And so that's nice, of course, because at least you get the illusion of getting to know people somehow better. But of course there's much more than that. I guess that you have not come just to hear some nice stories about blind or deaf people. There's much more. So this lecture will also be much about concepts. I think that we can't do without the concepts, so it's not possible to say, I have 3 disabilities, here we go, a capite ad calcem, from head to toe, so that's just not the thing to do. So first we need to think about the terminology. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that I will try to show you some images too. But the number of images will be quite limited for 2 good reasons. First of all, there's not too much. So there's not too much images to present about people with disability in antiquity, except for one case. But that was just the case I did not want to show every time again. That's the case of monsters, the case of teratology. But the monster thing would go very much against the whole tone of and contents also of the book. Because the question mark is very important here. Beperkt question mark. So actually, did people make something out of it or not? And so it's not a book about freaks or monsters. So of course you will have one of those dias too, but it's not the thing I would like to show you all the time. Okay. So stories, concepts and images. That will be the guideline for the presentation. I guess you all have the handout. So I'll just start with a very brief introduction for ancient historians, but also, of course, for other historians dealing with this phenomenon. First of all, before this book, there was really nothing like a big source collection, which enables you, for instance, to go and have a look for as many cases as possible of blind people, people with hearing impairment, etc., etc. So that's one of the main purposes of this book. I'm very glad that David's Fonds allowed me to have more than 80 pages of footnotes, indices. There's all sorts of indices, so you can read on passages, so ancient authors. You have the index locorum, but for instance there's also an index of all figures, and there's also an index just dealing with the separate disability. So you can read the book in very different ways, and it's really meant also as a kind of reference work if you want to find just instances of disabilities in antiquity. Second thing, it is about the Roman Empire. Is this Greek or Roman material? Well, it is Greek and Latin material at least. You will see that I will integrate quite some stories which you will find with Homer or which you will find with Herodotus. But these stories very much were part and parcel also of the mental background of the elite in the Roman Empire. So you really need those stories too. And I said at least Greek and Latin, because there's also very important material to be found in the Hebrew sources. And that's a problem for me, of course, because unfortunately I never studied Hebrew, but I had help of some colleagues who were quite skilled in it, and I was really amazed by the richness of material you find, for instance, in the rabbinic literature. These stories are often very funny. I just tell you one. There's a famous prescription saying the blind person is not allowed to be like the principal in the synagogue. And then they will say, but Rabbi so-and-so, he's blind. And the answer is, well, that's no problem. We're used to it. You know, so that's just a very practical solution that was sometimes taken, and so you will find these things mainly in the rabbinic sources. Other thing, this is really a subject for which you need anthropological and cross-cultural comparison. To me, the real beginning of this study was somewhere in 2008 when I was reading with some students a text by Herodotus. And I remember very well, it was one of the students, and it was his stepfather, he was from Albania. And so they went each year to Albania. And he said to me, well, Professor, the thing we read here, that's exactly the thing you will find now in Albanian villages. I will tell you afterwards when we come to the story. But you need to do that. There's much things which are not said, and then of course you need that learning from silence, or also the cross-cultural and anthropological comparison. It is a subject, this is point number 4, in which our values sometimes severely clash with ancient concepts and values. We'll talk about that later, but sometimes we just don't feel at ease, for instance, with the ancient vocabulary, which is not politically correct at all as we sense it. And then, of course, we need to be very humble, and we need to confess that this is a subject in which ancient history has been, for many years, much behind on other branches of history. Of course, there's good disability history studies from the 60s and from the 70s. But there's hardly a mention of antiquity, except for one thing. If they mention antiquity, it's always the infanticide thing, the exposure thing. And so they will say, well, in antiquity, disabled or infirm babies, they didn't really have the chance to survive. So there would not have been many disabled people in antiquity. If that would really be the case, then of course this book was not possible, and then of course it would be the end of the presentation too. But believe me, there's many instances of people who survived and who had a life as a disabled person. Okay, before we really start, we need to think about the terminology. And I propose that we just start with the standard definition, if you want. The definition of disability as you find it defined by the World Health Organization. I'm not going to read the whole fragment with you, but I think the first sentence is quite significant. The term persons with disabilities is used to apply to all persons with disabilities, including those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various attitudinal and environmental barriers, hinders their full and effective participation in society. So participation, functioning in society is very important. And it's a very broad concept because it can be physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory. There's even more. Just have a look at the last sentence. Disability resides in the society, with capital, not in the person. Well, this is a definition saying that, for instance, if you are in a wheelchair and you live in a society, in an environment where everything is perfectly adapted to that wheelchair, well, according to the definition, you're not really disabled in such a society. Whereas, as you would live, for instance, take a city like Urbino in Italy, and you just have difficulties walking, pain in your leg, something like that. You know, Urbino is very steep, it's very difficult to walk around. So that would mean that you really are disabled in that environment. It also means, for instance, if we think about learning disorders, that if you are in a school where teachers are very much keen on helping you with something like dyslexia, you're not really disabled. But if you are in a schooling system where this is not regarded at all, this can be a serious disability. Last week on Saturday I had the opportunity of doing this presentation, which was like 3 hours and a half, so it was for teachers' education in Antwerp, and so we had more time, and I just did an experiment writing like 10 or 15 things on the blackboard and asking, would that be a disability according to this definition or not? And we had a real interesting discussion, because for instance, I also wrote things like twins, being a twin. And of course people say that's not a disability, but there are actually cultures in which one of the two twins is considered as the bad one, and so the devil even, so that could be a serious disability. One might even say that according to these definitions, that homosexuality, for instance, in certain cultures can be a serious disability, and so on and so on. So this is really, I think, kind of too broad definition. So if you read these figures like 1 billion persons, 1 billion persons all over the world, so let's say like 15% of the world population is experiencing, they never say suffering, is experiencing a disability, well, I think we need to be very, very careful with those numbers. Once again, they use a very, very broad definition of disability. Now, of course, classicists and ancient historians among you might say, what are you doing? This is not the way to do it. Just start from Greek and Latin words, which have somehow the meaning of disability. But then, of course, there's a huge problem. Could you, people who know Greek and Latin, could you give me a term, Greek or Latin, which somehow matches the disability as it is mentioned in the definition? What would be a Greek or Latin translation for disability? I think you're very right to be silent, because there's not really a word like that. Well, of course, you could go and have a look in the famous speech by Lysias, and then the guy is saying about himself, I'm adunatos. But that's of course also infirm, that's weak, that all these things, that's adunatos. And in Latin, of course, there's infirmus, and there's debilis, and there's imbecilis, and there's all these words, but there's not really a word which matches somehow with our concept of handicap or disability. So, of course, there are words designating things like being blind, having problems with the ears, having problems with walking, etc., etc. So that you can do, of course. There's hundreds of terms for that. And that's what I basically did for compiling this book. This is going through the databases and just checking for these terms. That you can do. And there's one possible exception to the rule that there's not a general term, but this exception is very much related with the problem of freaks, monsters, the thing we call teratology. It's a discussion you find with the Roman jurists. They will say, when is a woman, when is a mother entitled to the jus trium liberorum? So, for those who don't do ancient history, it's kind of special privileges you got as a Roman citizen woman when you had 3 children. Of course, jurists will ask, what does this mean, having 3 children? We're dealing with times where infant mortality was just huge. So, what does it mean to have 3 children? If the baby just survives for 3 hours and he dies, does that count as one of the 3 or not? And then there's the discussion, what if the baby does not even resemble a human being? If he is, and that's of course that severe and harsh vocabulary, if he is a monstrum, well then perhaps it does not count. But there are in-between cases. What, for instance, if the baby would have like 6 fingers? That's the case of polydactyly. Well, then the jurist will say, well, of course you can recognize him as a human being, so he will count as one child. And then, if you do medieval philosophy, then you know everything about that. Of course, you get those discussions. Which is, are there cases contra naturam? Are there cases praeter naturam? Etc., etc. So, but that's a very complicated discussion, and we don't really, it's, what is it? Against nature, that's a very difficult and tricky thing, of course. There's one other possible term for disability. You might think, okay, there's of course the Latin word for morbus. If you're having a cold, then of course you have a morbus. But vitium is a kind of, well, deficiency. So would vitium be the disability and morbus be being ill? Well, actually, in the legal texts, not quite so. Quite the contrary. Imagine the following thing. You buy a slave. And the one who sells the slave doesn't tell anything about it, but he's meant to do manual work, and you come home and you see that actually the guy is almost totally blind. Well, according to the jurists, this is morbus, not vitium. Morbus is more severe than vitium. And morbus means that you're entitled to recompensation. So you can go back and say, well, actually, you didn't tell me, so just I want to have recompensation because this slave, I can't do anything with him. Now, other things. Imagine you buy a slave who actually turns out to be a stutterer. But you bought him for agricultural work. Stuttering is then simply a vitium. Nothing more, because he can do the work he wants to do. And of course, that's being a jurist. Then you have all those difficult cases. Imagine you buy a slave woman for reproduction, and she turns out to be sterile. It's of course always the woman who is to blame in the ancient way of thinking. Then, would that be a morbus or a vitium? If you really bought her for reproduction, well then it's morbus. But you can use her for other things, so perhaps it is just vitium. And then the jurists themselves say, well, this is not a normal way to do it in Latin. So, in normal, everyday Latin, having a cold is morbus, but having a real problem with your legs is vitium. But then they say, in juridical Latin, it's different. Morbus is always more severe than vitium. With morbus, you are entitled to recompensation. So this is, of course, in a very specific context. It's always about selling of slaves, but it's always also about functioning, being able to do some labor. Okay, I end this introduction on terminology with a kind of paradox, and that is the following. If we, with our concepts and with the definition of the World Health Organization, if we would go to antiquity, well, I'm sure we would find many, many people with disabilities. So just think about, of course, breaking a leg, something like that doesn't get healed well, and so you can be disabled for the rest of your life. So we would find, with these concepts of us, we would find many disabled people. If you would take a Roman to our 21st century, and you would ask him, is this person disabled or not? Well, he would surely laugh with many of our categories. Just think about the whole thing about social disability. Person blushing too much if he has to speak in public. Person being extremely shy and embarrassed about the fact that he's getting bald and doesn't want to come out anymore, doesn't want to appear in public. According to the World Health Organization, this could be really a social disability. There's no Roman who would think that Julius Caesar, who had the same problem about his baldness, there's no Roman who would really consider that as a disablement for Julius Caesar. And of course, there's also the huge paradox that those writers are not interested at all in our subject, in disabilities. But I don't think that needs to be a problem. There's not a Latin word, for instance, or a Greek word, which really match our sexuality or homosexuality. But there are very, very nice studies possible and done already on sexuality in antiquity. you can study things like racism in antiquity. Why not? There's good studies on that. Although, of course, they did not have a concept of race, let alone racism. So it's our question. Surely it's not an ancient question, but I think that still things can be done and studies can be done. Okay. So this is actually the book cover. It's, of course, sort of a parody, if you want. It's a mime where the myth of Oedipus is depicted, and of course you can see the mask and also the shoes which are connected to the theater. So it's actually Oedipus appearing here on a mosaic which is found in Spain. As I said, in the 60s and 70s, if they deal somehow with disabilities in antiquity, then it's always about the exposure and the infanticide thing. So we will deal with that first too. Very interesting thing. If you read these discussions, it's always 4 or 5 texts which are cited all over again. Every single time the same texts. And the most famous is, of course, the one I quoted in translation for you. The first you find on the handout. It's Plutarch in the life of Lycurgus, the founder, the legendary founder, if you want, or the legislator, I should say, the legislator of Sparta. Now, you can go to the text when you're at home or when you're just listening to me at the same time. But it's interesting. First of all, it's not just about a test, but it's about a double test. And the first test is really taken by the community. So it's not the parents who decide. And it says, of course, that if a child is weak or infirm, then he's just put on a quiet place in the Taygetus Mountains, and there he will die. Second is about a test for discovering epileptics. Now, there are serious problems, of course, with this text. First of all, Plutarch is writing in the 1st century CE. Lycurgus, if he has lived, because of course can be legendary, should be something like the 7th century BCE. So, of course, there's a huge time gap. Moreover, Plutarch is, of course, writing in what is well known as an utopian tradition about Sparta. So to him, like already for Plato or for Xenophon, Sparta was like the ideal state where everything is different. But this could be really like a utopia and not really referring to reality. There's more. There is no single archaeological evidence for the infanticidal thing in Sparta. So if you would have a place where for hundreds of years little babies are put, well, there could be a chance that you find something like bones, but there's nothing like that. And even more, there are some famous Spartans in history, a king and their national poet, who are actually known to have been disabled, maybe already from early age on. And they were aristocrats, and they survived. So I would say that the image of Sparta as the infanticidal state and the state where they practice selection is, of course, a very important image. We will see on the next slides why it is so important. But the historical, between brackets, value, are these real facts, is much to be questioned. 2 other texts, however, written in Latin, are quite clear, I think. The first is by Seneca Rhetor, the other is by Seneca the philosopher. So Seneca the Rhetor will say, many fathers are in the habit of exposing offspring who are no good. Some, right from birth, are damaged in some part of their bodies, weak and hopeless. Their parents throw them out rather than expose them. The Latin is very emphatic to say so. It says proiciunt, throw away, magis quam exponunt, rather than just put them somewhere. And the wise philosopher Seneca, in one of his treatises on controlling your anger, De Ira, will say, Unnatural prodigy we destroy. We drown even children who at birth are weakly and abnormal. Yet it is not anger, but reason that separates the harmful from the sound. So, what I would like to stress is that, of course, many babies who have visible difficulties from birth just did not survive. But if you ask me, how many? That's a question which is impossible to answer. Anthropologically, we know that there are many societies in which really high degrees of infanticide exist, and these degrees of infanticide do not hinder the fact that the population can even slowly grow. So that's a thing we know. But there's little texts about this. Why? Because this is often a thing which is decided upon among women, among the mother and the midwife. You just put the baby aside, and some hours later it will be dead. And of course that's not a thing you like to mention, that's not a thing that really is discussed later. This, you might have recognized it, comes from the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, Firenze. Here we have pretty exact numbers. We know, for instance, that in the beginning of the 15th century, 2% of the entire population of the city of Florence lived as little children in this hospital. This is huge, 2%. Because of course these 2% are only the ones who made it into the hospital. The ones who died the first hours, somewhere in a corner in a street, on the street, or somewhere on a belt or something. Well, they did not survive. So 2% is pretty high. And that is in a society where, of course, there was a big taboo against exposure and infanticide. This is already pretty much in a Christian era, which was not the case for antiquity before Christianity. So these are hints that well, somehow point out that really you should imagine a large amount of babies being exposed or even killed just after birth. However, some reasons to let the child live. There's a very nice article just about that. Would there be reasons, just if you see there's a problem, to let a child live? Well, of course there are. First of all, it is well known that the more sophisticated the diagnosis, the more difficult is the decision for the parents. Nowadays, parents have to make very vital decisions already when the baby still is in the womb. That's not the case, of course, in antiquity. For many things, they will perhaps think, okay, it's not really okay, this little child, but perhaps it will go better. We will just see. That's one thing. What if, for instance, you would have 3 babies who already died in childbirth, and now there's that one little baby. It's a male baby. Well, we just keep him. Why not? I'm not inventing things now. This is actually said about Claudius and his parents. So they already had many babies who died, and then there was that one child. They said, well, it's not really okay, but he's male, so he could be an heir, of course, too. And so we just take him. Other reasons could be, of course, things like, yeah, I already mentioned that. The gender thing, so the male hair, of course. So there might be things really saying, well, we just keep the child and we'll see whatever comes out. If you ask me, why are those texts about Sparta and those cliches about antiquity, why are they so important? Well, this is one of the reasons, of course, too. In the 30s of the 20th century, such texts were pretty much studied. Adolf Hitler, as you know, was of course a big admirer of the Greek corporal ideal, the Greek perfect body. You would find even studies in the 30s saying, for instance, that Socrates could not have been a real Greek. Because, of course, he was ugly. So there must be some Semitic root with him. But the real Greeks were, of course, there you have it, the Spartans. The Spartans who had some relation also with the Aryan people, with Aryan tribes. So that's the thing. So these texts are used and abused, of course. Just think about the propaganda also about what would happen to Germany if we would just have weak life, if we would have retarded people just reproducing themselves, that kind of things. And in the 50s, these very same texts have been cited over and over again just to prove the opposite, saying, hey, it was not the ancients who really thought about eugenetics. Don't blame them for that. Which is obvious, of course, because they did not have a concept of race. So how would they really have had a thing like eugenetics? So again, interesting, I think, just not only for the discussion about the infanticide, but also what do you do with it, and how do you use and abuse, let that be clear, how do you abuse these texts? Okay, finally, we can start now with the a capite ad calcem part, so the part from head to toe. And so for each disability I chose for one emblematic figure, and for the mental problems I just chose for Caligula. Now, first of all, what I'm going to tell you for the next 3 or 4 minutes, don't take it seriously. I'm going to tell you some things which I do not believe myself, and which any serious historian would not believe anymore nowadays. I tell you afterwards why it's still worth to mention these theories. Let us imagine the following situation. We would all be psychiatrists, and we would just put Caligula on the sofa. And we would just see what is wrong with him, just starting from texts like we have, of course, the biography by Suetonius. What would we diagnose? Well, pretty obvious, I think. This man was a pervert and a sadist. One of his biggest pleasures was having his meal and seeing people, hearing people screaming and seeing him being tortured. He even said about his wife, or to his wife, I love you so much that one day I will just torture you just to show you how much I love you. Things like that. If you take into consideration all Roman thoughts and thoughts and perception of sexuality, he would really be regarded as somebody who is a pervert in the literal sense of the word. He likes travesty. He's the one who likes to be disguised as Venus and just go out in the streets and being watched as the goddess of love. He suffers from all kinds of phobias. When there's lightning, he's that afraid that he just goes under his bed because he fears the lightning so much. He's really addicted to sex, and he spends large amounts of money on it. He's also the emperor, of course, who was known to throw out his money out of his palace on the Palatine and just enjoying himself by seeing how people just try to get some money and they're just hurting or even killing each other just to have the money. He is, of course, the emperor suffering from all sorts of psychotic moods. Isn't he the one who sent his army to Britannia? But then, of course, they just stop at the beaches in France and they come back and have collected, you know the story, of course, they have collected huge amounts of shells, and then the emperor will say, look at this is my victory against the god of the sea. And that was, of course, his big triumph. And there's, of course, all kinds of complexes which he suffered from. Again, the thing, he's getting bald quite soon, and he's very, very shy about that. And so he doesn't want people to sit above him in the theater so that they could see that he's actually getting bald. Okay. As I said you before, no serious historian would believe that these are real stories about Caligula. What actually happened, two things. I think, first of all, Suetonius, the one writing the biographies, really likes to show how the Julio-Claudian dynasty is degenerating. It's getting worse with them. And of course, these must be stories which have some truth, but there's lots of exaggeration and people liking these anecdotes. And of course, so when time passed by, of course, these anecdotes have just kind of been built up. But still, these anecdotes are interesting for at least two reasons. First of all authors, even somebody like Philo of Alexandria who has actually seen the young prince Caligula, all authors would agree that he was, in the beginning, a nice and perfectly normal, between brackets, guy. And then suddenly something happened. So that's, of course, the idea of the trigger. Something must have happened, and then, well, his behavior just got very, very sick and very bad. The other thing is, and the one does not need to exclude the other thing is the saying that Caligula was by nature bad. He just was able to hide it for about 25 years. But in principle, already as a little child, he was a bad person. That means you don't get that information, or you don't get that thoughts about possible traumas which must have happened in his youth. If we read the life of Caligula, we would say that he actually had a very, very traumatic youth. But there's no thinking like that. So they won't say, well, it's actually because of that youth he experienced that he became like that. For ancient doctors, it's very much physis, it's very much nature, it's just in you. Like the little daughter of Caligula, she was a very bad little child because she was the daughter of a monster. You know what she did? She used to scratch the cheeks of the other babies, which all babies do, of course. But in that case, it is said, well, she was a monster because she was the daughter of that monster, Caligula. Now, of course, you will also find more systematic thinking about mental disabilities in antiquity, and therefore there's one, well, there's many sources, but one really unique source is the enormous corpus of material you find with the doctor, 2nd century doctor Galenus. I just want to point to some categories which you find in the work of Galenus. First of all, there's something like the phrenitis. What is phrenitis? Phrenitis is always a temporary thing, and it's always connected with having temperature, with having fever. And there's two very nice stories which I would like to present you now. The first one is on the flute players. So it's actually about a man. He's hearing, well, every single day for some hours, he just gets fever and he's hearing loud music by flute players. And he says, I can't stand it anymore, it's just horrible. He goes to a doctor. The other anecdote is about a man who was used some days a week to throw out his furniture out of the window. And so, of course, people enjoyed that. They say, well, he's getting ill again, so we just go and we can grab some things. Till one day, he throws out his slave, and the slave dies. And of course, people say, well, that's a serious problem. He needs to see a doctor. He goes to the doctor. Well, Galen will say, both are suffering from phrenitis. But in the first case, this man, his reasoning, his intellect was perfectly normal. But there was a problem with illusions. He was actually hearing something which was not there. While for the other case, this man was not seeing illusions. No, he really knew that he was throwing his furniture. He really knew that he was throwing his slave. But of course, his mind, his intellectual capacity was deranged. So that's the two different forms of phrenitis you can get. Then there's mania. This is very much unclear. They're very ambiguous about that. But one could say that mania is always without fever and that it lasts for a longer time, that it's even permanent. And then there's melancholia, anxiety and the troubled mind. There's very nice stories about that too. There's the story about the man who actually believed that he was made out of clay. And he didn't want to go out anymore because he was fearing the rain. He was fearing that somehow he would dissolve. That's actually a case you find in psychiatric handbooks up to nowadays. Or the other man, just think about Asterix and Obelix, the other man who was constantly afraid that one day the sky would fall down because Atlas would be tired of doing his job and carrying the world and that kind of thing. So kind of a constant phobia. Now, Galen will say the following thing. Though every patient who suffers from melancholy acts in a different way, they all exhibit the same anxiety and troubled mind. They do not find any joy in life and they hate others. Not all melancholics have the desire to die. For some of them, fear of death is indeed a matter of the greatest sorrow during their melancholy. Others you will find behaving pretty strange in this. They fear death, but at the same time, they long to die. Isn't this a nice definition of the sort of paradox you can have also in cases of depression? And here comes, of course, a very interesting and intriguing question. Do some of these cases point to things that we might label as depression? Depression being one of the principal disabilities in the modern Western world according to the World Health Organization. Well, there's one definition by Galen saying the following thing. Melancholia is actually that you don't find joy anymore in the things you normally find so enjoyable. Isn't that a remarkable definition? It comes very close, of course, to what we would interpret as depression, some way or another. There's two other mental problems which are often mentioned. The first is morosis. That's connected with the cooling of the brain. But if you actually read the stories, it comes very close to something like dementia. It's often about memory loss, sometimes connected with old age, sometimes even represented as a hereditary matter, which is interesting if you think about Alzheimer's disease, as we know, being somehow hereditary too. And then, of course, there's the epileptic thing, the epilepsy, which is often called morbus comitialis. And if you use that term, of course, you come close to a concept of social disability, because, of course, it's connected with the fear of having death, illness, when you're just appearing publicly on the comitium, etc. Therefore, the morbus comitialis. Okay, we move on. And we go to the eyes, and the chapter on the eyes is entitled Erger dan de dood, worser than death. And of course, the emblematic figure I chose here is Homer. Of course, it doesn't matter at all whether Homer really has existed or not. It doesn't matter at all whether he was really blind or not. What is the point here? The vitae, the biographies I will deal with here, are actually written in Roman times. And people believed these stories to be really true. And what's more, these stories have actually lots of really revealing information on blindness. They have never been read before in that way. So I was really, when I discovered that, I thought there must be something about it, but you just read the stories, and you find really very nice things. I just go very briefly through the stories. First of all, Homer, in these Vitae, is born as a perfectly healthy child. So he's not blind at all. His mother doesn't have a husband. So she just chose to educate the baby by herself, didn't want to have guardians for him. And after a while, she gets to know a new partner, and he is a school teacher. That's very interesting because the school teacher is coming up on and on again in these stories. When Homer is about age 20, both his parents have died already. So he has some money and he decides just to go traveling on the coast of Asia Minor, of course. And then he gets sick, he recovers, he gets sick again, and then after that sickness he's blind. And what starts then is really a life of misery. So this is really a man trying to making the best out of it, but coping with lots of difficulties. For instance, he's going to one place and the only thing he can do, the only job he can perform there is the job of the cobbler. Which you find anthropologically nowadays too. If you're a cobbler, then of course it's just manual work, and then, well, you can do so if you're a blind person. Because he recites so well, there's also children sitting next to him and just listening to him reciting. He goes to another town because he knows that there's a kind of public welfare for blind people. And he asks for public welfare too, and they will say, just go away. We have enough of your people already. We don't want to have you. And then, of course, he curses the city, and the city will not ever have a poet in the town. But that's, of course, really typical anecdotes you will find. He goes to another place, and there he's just hired as, we would say, an assistant, a teaching assistant of a school teacher. What happens? Because he's reciting so well, that teacher is just listening to his poems and is actually writing them down. And then that bad teacher just leaves and he tries to sell the poems as if they were his own poems. Now, Homer doesn't know about that. One day he decides to make a travel. He wants to go to Chios, so of course needs to take a boat. Sailors don't want to have him on the boat. They say, go away, because this is just bad luck having a blind person on the boat. Of course there's a storm, they need to come back and they need to take him on the ship, and then the storm will just go away. That's again a typical Greek thing which you will recognize. He arrives at Chios. What does he have to do there? There's no guide dog for him. Nothing at all. You won't find that in antiquity. What is he doing? He's just following and grasping the sheep and the goats. And he's just going around among those sheep and goats. Till they encounter the shepherd. Sorry. So they just meet the shepherd. And the shepherd will say, well, come with me. We'll go to my boss and he will take care of you. When they come, and when they meet the shepherd's boss, he's actually very angry with him and says, what can I do with that blind person? I don't need him. This is just another mouth to feed. I don't want to have him. But something can be done. Okay, something can be done. Once again, he can take care of the children. He can recite well, so the children will like him. And that happens. And it's the same children, actually, who discover the fraud of the other schoolmaster, who happens to be there too at Chios. So it turns out that schoolmaster was actually faking that he was a big poet. He wasn't at all, and well, that is finally discovered by these children. So Homer lives on. He's always surrounded by children who take care of him, and in a way that also explains his death. Because one day he's sitting at a beach. And there are some young people coming, and they're saying, we're having a nice riddle to propose you. And the riddle goes as follows. What we collect, we leave behind. And what we do not find, we take it with us. what we collect, we leave it behind, and what we do not find, we take it with us. Cool, could solve the riddle. Actually, Homer dies just out of frustration because he cannot solve it too. But it's actually, I looked it up and I forgot the word in English again, Laes. It's lies. So the lies they're collecting from their body and just throwing it away, and if they don't find it, they take it with them. Something like that. So that's the life of Homer. What I want to stress here is that this is actually not the story about the divinely inspired poet who is honored, etc., etc. No, this is actually the story about a man who has to make the best out of it, but who copes with serious difficulties too. Now, that is the general image you find also when you study the blindness thing. So there's actually two possible ways of dealing with the subject. First of all, there's the jurists. And they will say blindness is, of course it's a bad thing, but it's not that bad. There are examples of magistrates carrying on after they became blind. You can marry, you can be a judge, for instance. There's instances of blind senators, which was possible, of course, if you're taking or carried around in a lectica, it's possible, so you can be helped. There's the whole philosophical discourse also on philosophers being somehow happy that they became blind, because then they get to see the real essence of things. You know, that kind of discourse, you find it. Sometimes these stories are very funny. There's one I really would like to tell you now. It's about a philosopher. His name is Antipater, and so he has many girlfriends, but he's getting blind. And of course his girlfriends are saying, well, they're very grieved by it. They say, well, that's a pity you're getting blind. And he says, ladies, there's nothing to worry about. As you know, there's many pleasures to be found in darkness. Things like that. That's the first approach. The other thing is, of course, that sometimes by these same authors, blindness is really mentioned as the odiosa caecitas. So it's the worst of things, the most hateful thing that can happen to you. And of course, key to understand the difference is social class. So if you're well surrounded, you can somehow carry on with your blindness. If you don't have a family, nobody to support you, then there's just the cliché, the topos, which was a social reality also, of becoming a beggar. The blind beggar is a topos you find in many passages, in many sources. That for blindness. We go on with a story which was in 2008 for me the discovery of the disability theme in a way. The text I read with my students, the Herodotus text, which was again very much a living reality also in Roman antiquity. The Herodotus text on the two sons of Croesus. Well, Croesus has two sons. The one is of course a very beautiful boy, a very handsome prince, is Attis. The other one, well, we don't even know his name, because, as you can read in the first fragment, now Croesus had two sons, one of which was defective, since he was a deaf-mute. The Greek word which is used here is kophos. And here, because the meaning is somehow ambiguous, but here it really must mean deaf-mute. What happens? Very Greek story, of course, you might know it. There has been the oracle saying that the beautiful boy Attis would once die. He would be killed by a spear. Of course, his father Croesus does everything to prevent this. So his son is not allowed to go to war, etc., etc. But one day, there's a wild boar terrifying the region. And so, of course, they're asking the prince, could you come with us? Could you hunt that animal and just kill him for us? And father says, no, no, no. You're not allowed to do that. I won't have you go hunting, because for you, that's the second fragment, for you are in fact my one and only son, inasmuch as I count the other indeed, since he is defective, not to be mine. The Greek says something like, Ugar enai moi nomizo. I think he does not really belong to me. But, as you can imagine, Attis will say, oh, father, I understand that you be so worried, but actually, a boar doesn't have a spear, so I won't be killed by him, don't worry. And then they go out hunting, and you know what happens, of course. There's another hunter just throwing his spear, and just missing, of course, and just hitting Attis, who is killed almost instantaneously. This is Croesus again. Might be a very familiar story, of course, for the ancient historians among you. This is Croesus again, after his capital Sardes has been taken by the Persians. He was just sitting there in Sardes, being very, very depressed, so everything was over for him. And there was a soldier coming, and the Persian soldier, didn't know that he was the king, and he was intending just to kill him. And then there was the other son. Once again, we don't even know his name. And so when the soldier just does like this with a sword, the boy cries out, don't do this, don't kill him, he's my father, he's the king. And from that moment on, he spoke for the rest of his life. So, story. And this is Croesus, when afterwards, of course, he's sentenced to death by the Persian king, he's put on the pyre, and of course, here he's ready to die, and he's just reflecting upon his life. And that's the third fragment. Accordingly, in his bygone well-being, Croesus had done everything for him. That's for the deaf-mute boy. He had thought up other plans, and especially to Delphi had sent men to consult the oracle about him. So, if you're worried about Croesus' fate, of course, he won't die on the pyre, because rain will come, and then he will get released, and then afterwards he will be one of the main counselors of the Persian king. But that's another story. Anyway, this fragment makes clear that the one does not exclude the other. I mean, if we just read the first and the second fragment, we think, oh, that's very cruel, because they don't want to mention him. It's like not being a real son of mine. But on the other hand, he cared for the boy. And he had done everything possible just to help him. This was exactly the thing this student told me about Albania. He would say, you would go to a village there, and a father would say, I have 3 children, and actually has 4. But the 4th is not mentioned. He's somewhere in the house. He's taken care of, but it's not a thing you like to mention, that you have that child with problems. So that's pretty much the same line of thinking you find here. Once again, social class is crucial to understand the difficulties of being deaf, mute in antiquity. For the aristocracy, this is very much an oral culture. All education is, of course, based, as you know, on orality. So you have to repeat things. There's a drill, all that kind of things, which is, of course, utterly impossible if you don't hear. Here you have the judgment that people who do not hear are actually also intellectually retarded, which you find till the 16th, 17th century, even in the 19th century. There have been religious orders here in Flanders really taking care of such children, but before it was often thought that they were just intellectually retarded. Some Latin authors will say mutus is connected to mugere, luien, the sound which a cow makes. So that's really the connection with animals and with low intellect. On the other hand, And that's also an anthropological fact. While for aristocrats, this is one of the worst things that can happen. Yeah? You're not allowed, of course, to be a magistrate, to be a judge. You can't do anything. It's really, nothing is possible. At the same time, in villages, this was not a real problem. For agricultural work, for much of the normal things in a village, a deaf mute can function as any other person. So here one could say that this was really for the high class more of a problem than for other people. We go on with the speech impairment. You should just try, perhaps now or when you're at home, if you Google Demosthenes. Do you know what is? When I prepared it, was the second hit that comes out.
The bubbles on the beach?
Yes. Okay. And more than that, you'll get connected instantaneously to the an association of stutterers in the Netherlands. Demosthenes NL, something like that. Okay, so he's an emblematic figure, of course, of a stutterer. But very interesting. If you go carefully through all the texts, through the ancient authors, then you will see that there's not one single instance unambiguously saying that Demosthenes was what we would call a stutterer. When he was a teenager, he actually prosecuted his guardians, who had taken advantage of their position just to take much money from him. And he was successful. How would you do so if you're a real stutterer? In fact, all the stories about Demosthenes are stories about, well, just coping with your difficulties and just making the best out of it and being believing in yourself through intense training. That's the thing. What we read about Demosthenes is that he had problems making himself clear in the ecclesia, for instance. But imagine, as you know, Greeks have some problems with being silent. So imagine just 4,000 people being there. No microphones, nothing like that. And you really have to attract the attention of all those people. How do you do? It's very difficult. It's about that. It's about the training to become like a real good orator. Also the thing about pedals in the mouth. Also the thing about exercising the own voice while being on the beach. It's about that. It's about training. It's not about stuttering. But of course the image remains important, because when you went to the king's speech, yeah, and when the king is following therapy, well, it's exactly that therapy with the pebbles, and it's Demosthenes who is mentioned, of course. Same thing for Moses. When Moses is asked to speak on behalf of the Jewish people before the Pharaoh, he will say, how can I do this? In the face of God, I'm just a stutterer. Again, this is very interesting. There's a whole rabbinic tradition stating that Moses was a stutterer, connecting it with an apocryphal story about charcoal which was put in his mouth, and then of course the mouth was burned, and then that would have been the cause of his being a stutterer. While on the other hand, there's a whole patristic tradition saying, no, this is stuttering in the face of God. We all should be stutterers in the face of God. This is just symbolic. But again, you find lots of ideas about stuttering in these discussions about Moses. Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, of course, after Claudius, we all believe he was a stutterer, because of course it was represented like that. If you read the ancient text, it just says that he was a man not very much capable of self-control. So when he got really angry, he had difficulties with his words, and then he was somehow stuttering, which is of course not the same as what we would call a real stutterer. I had real difficulties, so if you go through the chapter you will see there's some indications of stuttering, but the vocabulary is also very difficult, so I had really difficulties to find unambiguous instances till I found a text like Caelius Aurelianus, which is so nice that I wanted to quote it for you on the handout. This is a doctor writing in the 5th century CE. In North Africa, he is writing in Latin. We don't know much about him. We don't know anything about his patients, but he has those intriguing case stories in his Tardarum Passionum. This is really an interesting text. He's saying you should encourage people to speak in all sorts of ways. If they keep on not succeeding in these cases in which the tongue refuses functioning, you should encourage them to form in their thought the words which they cannot pronounce. For it happens that the air which is formed in the depths of the lungs starts moving and eventually molds the words which have been conceived in the minds of those who want to speak. This is pretty modern. So if you can't say it, just think about it first. In each case, you should encourage them to take special care of the pronouncing of the first letter. By training themselves in a diligent way, they have to learn to pronounce at least this letter in the right way. It is best to do this with vowels, so that the organ of speech is not closed or hindered by the difficulty of pronouncing the sound of the letter. If they succeed, we proceed with proposing nouns and proper names which have many vowels, like payan or similar words. Of course, you don't start with strefen or something like that, but payan is a good word to start with. In the same way, we will dish up numerals, and we will force our patients to shout these words. If you have seen the King's Speech, it's exactly that. One moment, he's saying, well, shout, just count, and then say 1, 2, and it's a thing you find also in therapy nowadays, because numerals are of course short. You can just ask people to shout, to shout, to shout. Afterwards, this is a bit fast, but anyway, it's like that in the text. Afterwards, we offer them the exercise of reciting and discussion. So obviously, these were rich patients. These were aristocrats having problem with something which is called ischnophonia. But I think all of you would agree that this comes very close, of course, to what we would call speech impairment, or the stuttering. Following chapter takes us to the mobility impairment, where Philippus of Macedonia is, of course, the emblematic figure. Why? Because there's an anecdote about him. Again, you can say, well, you find this anecdote many times, and it's not sure that it was connected with Philippus. That's of course, that's true. But the thought, again, is very, very important. To me, this is an anecdote which really summarizes the problem of being a war veteran. As you know, of course, Philip of Macedonia was a war veteran. He was suffering from severe problems with walking, limbs, was wounded many times, also his eye, of course, you know that story too. And so one day, he's just afraid of showing up in public because he has difficulties walking. And then, according to the anecdote, his son, Alexander, would have said, "Father, don't be afraid. With each step you set, people will be reminded of your virtue." And that is, of course, what you find so many times when we talk about war veterans. It's not a thing you want to see. It's not nice to see these people being wounded, suffering, coping with difficulties. But on the other hand, we have to see it because it reminds us of being brave, of virtue, and that kind of stuff. Now for this chapter, I also made quite some use of material which is explained to me and to us, because of course I cannot interpret these sources, by archaeologists and osteologists. So there's excavations all over the Roman Empire which always point to the same thing, which in the book I have called History of Pain and Suffering. You really find many instances of people having broken a limb. Afterwards, it never gets healed in the right way. So they're just experiencing problems with mobility for all of their lives. Painful conditions. And what is more, you find all those people really suffering, having what we would call osteological malformations, problems with the spine, problems with the position of the head, all kind of things. Well, at the same time, on their bones, you find traces of harsh, strenuous, and continuous labor. So, although they must have experienced many problems, it is sure that they worked for a long period in their life. And what's even more, they are just buried together with other people. So they're really not, in burial practice, they're not considered as outsiders or something. They're just buried with the others. Which means, just think about that. If you hear about the community concept, saying that, well, nowadays, because we have so many categories, we somehow exclude people, while in other societies they were much more included into society. Well, that's true. That's very much true. But you also need to say the other thing. That is, they were included because there was no choice. They had to work. Even when it was physically hardly possible, according to our standards or our ways of feeling pain, well, there was just no choice. So integration is not always a positive story. It can be also the thing, you just have to do it. Okay, I come to the conclusions. What I try to do in the concluding chapter is to look for certain categories by which Romans disabled in some way or another other people, and whether these categories somehow match our categories of disability or not. So I just give you some examples. First of all, that's one I'm not going to explain this anymore. It's the functioning and labor criterion, which we had already. So this is pretty much connected with the community concept. It's also connected, of course, with the morbus and vitium discussion in case of slaves, selling of slaves. Perhaps there's a definition by Galen. Galen says, health is a condition which enables you to perform whatever you want. Which is a nice thing, of course. It's again in that thinking about social functioning, labor, and that sort of thing. So that's a category, you could say. They think about it and they say, if you're not able to work, to function, well, that's something like a disability. I also tried to integrate into my research the World Happiness Index as it exists, and also the capabilities and the functioning and capabilities theory as it is developed by American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. It's a pity that Kathleen van Dorpen is not here, because she uses it in her research too. I'm sure you have heard about it, the problems with finding happiness and that kind of things in the papyri. So that's the thing I wanted to use here too. I just mentioned one fact I developed in the book. Of course, there are many problems. I know that interviewing people about happiness, I know it's a tricky thing, but anyway, you will find pretty much the following. When people are for the first time in their life confronted with a disability, well, that means suffering. This is a book also, I try to take human suffering very seriously. I think we all like to be healthy. And that we need to respect our bodies too. Well, if people are experiencing a disability, in the beginning, they will say in interviews, I feel very, very unhappy. But then, after some years, that can change. And that is always connected with the way society deals with it. So in societies in which you have lots of possibilities for these people, well, you will find higher grades of happiness too. That's a very obvious thing, I know, but I try to develop that in a kind of experiment of thought also for Roman Empire, and then I think we have to admit that for many people it must not have been a very happy way of living. I promised you one slide with teratology, so here we go. The freaks. That's the subject, of course, of the monsters and what is called also the anti-physiognomics. What is this? This is very much also connected with what I've listed as a political invective. These things, these little statues, these statuettes are things that you have in your house, and it's just for fun. Yeah, you show it to other people. It has that meaning of I'm rich. Those people can be around me. They can beg or something, but I'm rich. I'm not having that. Something like that must be the meaning of it. And of course, what's popular? Dwarfs. Dwarfs, which are of course known for their well-pronounced genitals, as you can see on the left. In the middle, that's of course nothing really to do with anorectics or something. It's just laughing about a person who is really, really thin or too thin. The other one is on malformation, of course, too, and so there's problem with the bones and all that kind of stuff. And the picture on the right is genre they like a lot too. It's the unexpected thing, surprise. Because of course you see the head of a, well, it's a very Greek head, of course, could be a philosopher, an emperor, why not? And then, well, you just look at the chest and there's of course a serious malformation of the bones. Like they like also statues of the hermaphrodite. So you see on the back and you think, oh, this is a nice lady, and you see also there's breasts, and then suddenly, oh no, it's also a man. Something like that, the hermaphrodite. That's also the unexpected thing which they like to emphasize. Now, you can use this anti-physiognomical thinking, which actually means when you're ugly from outside appearance, that means that you also have a bad character. You can use that very much ad hoc, as I've called it in the book. So you can use it whenever you want, not as a real category, but whenever it suits you. And then we come into the difficult subject also of humor and laughing about disabilities. Cicero actually says that it's a very good thing to do as an orator to make fun of your political enemy because of his physical appearance. And so there's one famous victim. It's Vatinius, that's a victim of Cicero, and he was suffering from what is called in English the gloire. So it means krop, as we say in Dutch. So it means that you have really like a huge ball, to say so here. Well, actually, Cicero calls Vatinius a swollen orator. And he thinks that's very funny, because he cites it as appropriate humor. And one day, Vatinius, who had also problems with gout and so in his legs, one day Vatinius said, oh, today I've walked already 3 miles. And Cicero said in the Senate, I didn't know that days were that long nowadays. And he thinks that this is a very appropriate way of laughing with others. It's just allowed to do so. Bert Gewart, who is actually my first doctor, so he defended his PhD last year, and it's about humor and deformity in the epigrams of Marshall. And in preparing that doctorate, he also interviewed some stand-up comedians nowadays, asking them, what would you think is appropriate to laugh with, or what would you never do? I'll ask you. Many would say, okay, I can make fun of, well, let's say, the weight, the corpulence of a politician like Marie de Blok. People make fun of that. We can do so, said those stand-up comedians. Nobody would ever even think about making humor on behalf or about Helga Stevens, who is an N-VA member of parliament, who actually is deaf-mute, and so she has to use, of course, an interpreter, and she herself, she's not able to speak properly. Nobody makes fun of that. Why? Why do you think so? Why do we laugh with corpulent people? Why do we like to see the YouTube movies where you see Dardenne being utterly drunk in the parliament, which is of course not a funny thing because alcoholism is a serious problem, but we laugh with it. But we won't ever laugh with the deaf-mute politician. Why? Yeah.
Maybe because you could do something about being fat. That's the idea of our present society. That it's your own fault.
Yes, thank you. That's very much the thing. So it's about guilt. Your own fault. Well, do you know that Aristotle, in his Ethica Nikomachea, he said the following. He says, of course we won't laugh with a person being blind, except if we know that he's blind because he drinks too much, then we can make fun about him. That's exactly the same thing. So the problem of guilt. And that's also the thing, so if you read those epigrams by Marshall, which are really crude, really harsh, so they're really laughing with deformities of people, it's always about deformities which are somehow, you are somehow to blame for it. It's very moralizing in a way, the humor they make. What I also try to do in the concluding chapter is to have a look at four reactions anthropologists try to discern when disabilities are concerned, and which you also find in the ancient sources. There's the thing of dread, the evil eyes, yeah, the evil eye. Sorry, the consequence of parental faults or sins. Sex on Sunday. What is that? You find it in Gregory of Tours. There's a mother, and she gave birth to a baby, and the baby looks like a monster. And she's very much afraid because all people would laugh at the child, but also at her. And why? She's married. It's nothing because otherwise that would have been mentioned. But people would say that couple, they had sex on a Sunday or on a holy day. And they're to blame because the child is a monster. Pity. There's a whole discourse on pity, which you find with Aristotle, but which you also find with John Chrysostom. There's a whole discourse on why do you give to a disabled beggar? Because you think it could be me. And I would be glad to have some help. And that's why you give. Fascination. That's of course the thing about the monstra, the moriones. Mockery and disdain, of course, this is also connect with those statuettes. One final question. The question of continuity and change and the role of Christianity. Now, this is actually a project and a research question which I hope to develop in the next years to come, because there's so much to do there just for the late ancient sources. Of course, I don't need to tell you that you have like 10 times more source material for early Christianity. That's very obvious, because of course the saints who are mentioned, they always do miracles which Jesus Christ did. And so they're of course healing the blind, healing the crippled, etc., etc. But in these stories you find lots of hints also on daily life, daily conditions, attitudes towards these people. So you find lots of things in early Christianity, and I have used quite some Christian sources in the book too. What could be new things coming up in Christianity? Well, of course, what is change, and on what level would you view that? First thing, this is actually a religion which somehow praises martyrdom. But praising a martyr is somehow also praising a maimed or mutilated body. would this mean that people actually regarded suffering and possibly disability in a different way? And would that only be theory, or would that impact also in practice? Could you say, well, I have that main body like that saint? Interesting question, I think. The whole question of charity. First, hospitals, except for the military ones, because that's another thing, I'm sure that Cornel will ask something about that, but first, hospitals. And so the real idea of charity and really taking care of the other, well, these hospitals have to be situated in the beginning of the 5th century, Constantinople, 425, something like that. The whole discussion on the birth of the hospital, which you may know. And you get the same thing in early Islam, of course, the obligation of caring for the blind, the deaf, and that sort of things. So, would charity really have impacted on the way disabled people were viewed and treated? Other thing, and this is not merely theology. What about Resurrection Day? Will we not all rise with perfect bodies? What is that? With perfect bodies. St. Augustine will say, well, it's the body you have when you're about age 30. That's your perfect body. But then, of course, he thought about that, and others too. I said, let's imagine that guy, you have always known him as a crippled or as a blind person, and then on Resurrection Day, what would he look like? And how would you recognize him? Interesting. Theologians will say, actually, that blindness, that being crippled, having a hunchback, something like that, that's not the essence of the person. So he will just appear with his perfect body, and the other things are just accidents. Could happen to him, but that's not him. And that's interesting, of course. We get a discussion, is this just an accident, or is this really you, that disability? The guilt thing is also something. Because if you just have one God, who is to blame for the disability? I'm putting things far too simple, because of course there's all sorts of solution like demons and the devil, etc., etc. But basically, monotheism, who is to blame when something goes wrong? And of course, for late antiquity, you have all those different traditions going from Coptic to Ethiopic, Syriac, Aramaic, Byzantine things. So there's lots of regional diversification which comes up too. Okay. I end my book, and I also end this presentation with a fairy tale you find with Hans Christian Andersen, and it's about the emperor's new clothes. Of course, you know the story. It's the king or the emperor just walking on the streets totally naked, and of course everybody laughs at him. But he thinks he's just the intelligent guy, because of course the tailor has said, only intelligent people will recognize your perfect clothing. Well, the image I want to develop in the book is the following thing. Studying history is always like time traveling. It's going to other cultures. So, it's also about fitting clothes. We have tried to find or to match our categories to ancient categories. And we found out that these do not match entirely. So there's no real clothes which can fit us if we use our categories. At the same time, I firmly believe that if we go to the past with a sort of empathy for other people, knowing that we are dealing with human beings, well, that we can say something sensible about them. And that we don't run the risk of just being utterly silly and just walking around nakedly like the emperor in the Hans Christian Andersen story. That's where I would like to end. Thanking you for your attention.